along the central coast of California, where the Pacific Ocean stretches out like an endless sheet of dull silver and the salty wind carries the scent of seaweed. A solitary rocky hill rises from the vast open landscape. Before this place was known as Hearst Castle, before limestone walls and Spanish-style bell towers cut into the horizon, the hill was simply part of an untamed natural world, where cattle grazed and the ground bore the faint traces of generations who had lived and then disappeared. But at the beginning of the 20th century, that hill began to take on a different meaning. It became a meeting point of ambition, memory, and power, inseparably linked to a man whose influence would reach deep into American culture and politics, William Randolph Hearst. William Randolph Hearst was not born into poverty or obscurity. He grew up within a wealthy family, surrounded by comforts that most Americans of his time could only imagine. His father, George Hearst, was a mining magnate who amassed a vast fortune from gold and silver during America's westward expansion. His mother, Phoebe Person Hearst, was an educated woman with a deep love of art, a passion for collecting, and a profound influence on the way William viewed the world. From her, Hearst inherited a fascination with beauty, with classical history, and with the idea that architecture was not merely a place to live, but a declaration of identity and power. As Hearst came of age, he entered the world of journalism with an ambition no less audacious. He did not simply want to publish newspapers. He wanted to shape public opinion, to command public emotion, and to redefine the way America told stories about itself. His media empire expanded rapidly, spreading across major cities with sensational headlines, bold narratives, and an influence unlike anything seen before. Within Hearst, economic power, political reach, and cultural authority merged, creating a figure both admired and deeply controversial. Yet alongside the bright lights of newsrooms and boardrooms, Hearst carried another desire, more private and more enduring, one that would ultimately be carved into stone. The hill at San Simon was no accidental choice. For Hearst, it was bound to childhood memory, to family journeys, to a feeling of freedom and separation from the outside world. When he decided to build there, his initial goal appeared modest. Hearst spoke of a ranch retreat, a place where family and friends could gather, far from the pressures of business and politics. But even in the earliest sketches, it was clear that this project would not remain a simple home. It contained the seeds of something far larger, a structure that would exceed practical living needs and strive instead for permanence and symbolism. To bring this vision to life, Hearst turned to Julia Morgan, one of the first and few women to receive formal architectural training at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Morgan was not only a masterful engineer, but also someone capable of listening and translating complex, shifting ideas into physical form. The relationship between Hearst and Morgan lasted for decades, defined by both collaboration and tension. Hearst constantly altered his demands, adding details and expanding the scope. Morgan, with extraordinary discipline and patience, continued to draw, revise and build, laying stone by stone, wall by wall. The early years of Hearst Castle's construction unfolded as America itself was changing at a rapid pace. Industrialization, urban growth, and social transformation created the sense that the old world was giving way to a new era. Against this backdrop, the mansion on the hill at San Simon took on the character of a quiet resistance. It did not look forward in a modern sense, but backward, drawing inspiration from classical European architecture, Spanish monasteries, Mediterranean castles, and the enduring symbols of feudal power. Hearst was not simply building a residence. He was recreating a world he admired, one in which authority was expressed through stone, space, and the endurance of form. Yet from the very beginning, a contradiction emerged. The estate was built to convey a sense of completion, but it never truly reached a finished state. Auxiliary buildings rose, were altered, and expanded again. Rooms were designed, completed, and then changed. Hearst continuously added works of art, ancient sculptures, carved ceilings, tapestries and furnishings from across Europe. Each object carried its own historical narrative, but when assembled together, they formed a space that was both magnificent and fragmented, mirroring the inner landscape of its owner. In this first part of the story, Hearst Castle appears not merely as an architectural achievement, but as a process in motion. It is the product of childhood memory, media power, artistic obsession, and an ambition that refused to come to rest. On that hilltop, every stone laid was not only meant to build walls, but to answer a silent question: can human beings fill the empty spaces within themselves with space, with beauty, and with grandeur? And from that question, the story of Hearst Castle begins to unfold, slowly, deliberately, and with no possibility of turning back. As the first walls of Hearst Castle began to take shape on the hilltop at San Simon, the project moved far beyond the idea of a private retreat. It gradually became a visible declaration of power, not military or political power in the traditional sense, but the power of image, culture, and the ability to shape collective imagination. William Randolph Hearst understood the force of symbols better than most. Throughout his career in journalism, he had learned that people do not respond to facts alone, but to how those facts are presented. Now, on a hill overlooking the Pacific Ocean, he was presenting himself to the world. The construction of Hearst Castle unfolded over decades, without a single, fixed master plan. Hearst was not searching for completion, but for continuous control. He sent Julia Morgan hundreds of letters, sometimes filled with obsessive detail, sometimes offering only vague impressions of how a space should feel. Bell towers were raised, then lowered. Guest houses were added, then expanded again to accommodate an ever-growing art collection. Each change reflected a moment in Hearst's life, a state of mind, permanently embedded in the structure of the estate. Hearst Castle began to resemble a small city. Beyond the main residence, Casa Grande, there were guest houses, carefully designed gardens, swimming pools, ballrooms, libraries, and a private cinema. Every space was calculated to impress, but not through crude display. Instead, the impact came through accumulation, through the sense that visitors were moving through a carefully staged world, where every viewpoint carried a theatrical quality. During the 1920s, as the United States entered a period of post-war prosperity following the First World War, Hearst Castle became an unusual center of social life. Politicians, Hollywood stars, writers, and artists were invited to San Simon, not merely to rest, but to take part in the world Hearst was constructing. Long dinners, conversations by the fireplace, and private film screenings unfolded within spaces designed to remind guests that they stood inside the domain of a man who could connect media, art, and political influence. Behind this spectacle, however, another rhythm existed, slower and often lonelier. Hearst rarely felt satisfied. Each completed room gave rise to another idea. Every newly installed artwork revealed another space that seemed incomplete. Rather than providing stability, the mansion became a mirror of inner restlessness. It grew larger and more complex, yet never delivered a sense of finality. Julia Morgan, as the figure who translated ambition into reality, witnessed this endless expansion with remarkable professionalism. She understood that this project was not simply architectural, but psychological. Morgan did not impose her own vision. Instead, she patiently adapted her designs to Hearst's continual revisions. This flexibility made Hearst Castle unlike any other structure. It did not adhere to a single architectural style, but deliberately combined multiple eras, regions, and layers of meaning. From a distance, Hearst Castle resembled a European fortress transplanted onto the California coast. Yet inside, visitors encountered a tension between past and present. Ancient stone walls enclosed modern conveniences. Sculptures centuries old stood beside the most advanced electrical and plumbing systems of their time. Hearst did not want to live in the past, but he also rejected a present stripped of historical depth. The estate became a place where two timelines overlapped, expressing the desire of a man who wanted to possess both heritage and future. In this second part of the story, Hearst Castle emerges no longer as a private dream, but as a stage of power. It is where Hearst demonstrated his ability to shape space, people, and memory. And yet, within this relentless expansion, a question began to surface more clearly. Could power and beauty ever bring a sense of wholeness, or did they only expose the emptiness they were meant to conceal? That question would follow the mansion into the turbulent chapters of history that lay ahead. As the world entered the 1930s, the reality beyond the hilltop at San Simon began to change in ways that could not be reversed. The Great Depression struck the United States like a prolonged earthquake, shaking the foundations of the economy, society, and collective confidence. While millions lost their jobs, homes were foreclosed, and long lines of the unemployed stretched outside soup kitchens, Hearst Castle continued to rise, to expand, and to consume immense resources. That contrast transformed the mansion from a personal symbol into a public provocation. William Randolph Hearst, once at the peak of his media power, began to feel the growing fragility of the empire he had built. Newspaper revenues declined, investments became increasingly risky, and financial pressure mounted. Yet rather than retreat from San Simon, Hearst appeared to cling to it more tightly. Hearst Castle was no longer merely a retreat or a stage of power. It became a psychological refuge, a place where the illusion of control could be preserved while the outside world slipped further beyond his grasp. The architectural decisions made during this period reflected that state of mind. Expansion slowed, but ornamentation intensified. Hearst demanded ever more intricate decorative details and spaces with an increasingly ceremonial character. The grand dining hall, with its towering ceiling and elongated table, was arranged like a feudal great hall, with the host seated at the center, commanding the atmosphere of the entire room. Each dinner became a ritual, reaffirming an order of power that Hearst sought to maintain. At the same time, the relationship between Hearst and Julia Morgan subtly shifted. Morgan continued her tireless work, but now faced increasingly rigid constraints, both financial and practical. Their correspondence from this period reveals a quiet tension. Hearst continued to issue new demands, while Morgan was forced to adapt within tightening limitations. It was precisely within these constraints that her skill became most evident. She was no longer simply building, but balancing, refining, and at times restraining ambition so that the project could endure. While Hearst Castle functioned as a closed world, Hollywood to the south was entering its golden age. Film stars, producers, and directors became frequent guests at San Simon. They arrived bearing the glamour of the screen, yet once inside the estate, they too became part of a carefully controlled narrative. Conversations between celebrities and politicians unfolded beneath stone arches and beside ancient artworks, creating a space where public image and lived reality blended seamlessly. Hearst Castle did not merely reflect its era. It helped shape how that era would be remembered. Yet extravagance during a time of widespread hardship could not go unnoticed. Public perception began to shift. Hearst Castle increasingly symbolized inequality, a visible reminder of a powerful elite, seemingly detached from the suffering of ordinary citizens. Hearst, who had once positioned himself as a champion of the people through his newspapers, now faced a bitter paradox. The very image he had constructed turned back upon him, challenging his credibility. In this third part of the story, Hearst Castle stands at the center of a turbulent age. It is no longer just the product of individual ambition, but a mirror reflecting the economic, social, and cultural tensions of Depression-era America. The mansion remains imposing and intact, but invisible fractures begin to appear, not in stone, but in the narrative of power and permanence itself. From those fractures, deeper questions emerge as history continues its relentless movement forward. As Hearst Castle moved into the mid-20th century, its physical expansion began to slow, but the psychological depth it reflected became increasingly pronounced. If in its early years San Simon had served as a place where Hearst projected power outward to the world, it now turned inward, becoming a space where contradictions, fears, and unfulfilled desires were etched into every room. The mansion was no longer merely architecture. It became a map of a human life. William Randolph Hearst began spending more time at San Simon, gradually withdrawing from the pace of major cities. This withdrawal was not a complete retreat from power, but a shift in how it was exercised. Hearst continued to control his media empire from a distance, through correspondence and intermediaries. Meanwhile, the Hilltop estate became his emotional center, a place where he sought stability in an increasingly unpredictable world. The long corridors, winding staircases, and interconnected rooms formed a space that was at once protective and isolating, mirroring the inner state of a man accustomed to being surrounded by people, yet rarely truly close to them. One of the defining elements of this period was Hearst's relationship with Marion Davies, the Hollywood actress who became his longtime companion. Davies was not simply a guest at Hearst Castle, but an integral presence in its daily life. Her energy brought a different rhythm to the estate, less ceremonial and more human. She organized informal performances, entertainment, and moments of intimacy that softened the scale of the vast interiors. Yet even within that warmth, an unspoken distance remained, because the mansion itself, by its very size and structure, continually reinforced hierarchies of power. Julia Morgan remained involved, though the nature of her role evolved. New construction demands gave way to refinement, adjustment, and completion of existing spaces. Morgan worked increasingly as a steward, attempting to bring coherence to a structure shaped by decades of shifting vision. In doing so, Hearst Castle revealed its most defining trait: it was a project without a final form. It lacked closure because it was bound to a mind that resisted endings. Private spaces such as the library, personal bedrooms, and enclosed gardens grew in significance. These areas offered Hearst moments of quiet, standing in contrast to the grand halls once used for spectacle and social display. Surrounded by rare books, artworks, and collected objects, Hearst confronted himself and the meaning of what he had built. In this phase, the mansion ceased to be a public symbol and became a personal mirror. For those who lived and worked at Hearst Castle, this period followed a steady, almost timeless rhythm, largely disconnected from the outside world. Staff members from housekeepers and chefs to gardeners maintained a self-contained environment governed by San Simon's internal rules. That stability offered security, but it also deepened the estate's isolation. Hearst Castle became a small, insular community, orbiting around the presence and moods of its aging owner. This fourth part of the story marks a subtle yet profound transition. Hearst Castle was no longer defined primarily by display, but by its capacity to absorb and reflect inner life. Ambition slowed but did not disappear. Power remained, but in a quieter form. Within this space, questions of fulfillment and meaning grew more personal and more persistent. Those questions would continue to echo. Time and history moved forward, shaping not only the fate of the mansion, but the legacy of William Randolph Hearst himself. As the world moved into the 1940s, Hearst Castle was no longer defined by expansion, but by the unmistakable presence of time and history. The Second World War reshaped global rhythms, and even a place as secluded as San Simon could not remain entirely untouched. Social gatherings became fewer, visits from elites grew rare, and the estate, once a stage of power and spectacle, took on a markedly more subdued atmosphere. William Randolph Hearst had now entered the final chapter of his life. Declining health forced him to reduce both his physical movement and his mental reach. Decisions once made with confidence became slower, more cautious. In this period, Hearst Castle resembled a diary written in stone, recording not only what had been built, but also what would never be completed. Abandoned plans and unfinished ideas emerged as silent pauses within the architectural narrative. The war imposed new constraints on materials, labor, and national priorities. Construction at San Simon came nearly to a halt. Julia Morgan, who had devoted decades to the project, gradually withdrew from active involvement. The silence of work sites, once alive with the sound of stone and tools, created the sensation of an ending that was never formally declared. For the first time since construction began, Hearst Castle stood still, not because it was finished, but because history no longer allowed it to continue growing. In this stillness, the meaning of the mansion began to shift. Vast rooms designed to host hundreds now felt oversized for a small number of residents. The emptiness carried a dual sensation of grandeur and loneliness. Hearst, who had long believed that scale and beauty could bring fulfillment, now confronted a reality in which space, when stripped of movement and people, amplified loss rather than satisfaction. Hearst's relationship with Marion Davies during this period became quieter and more centered on care. Davies acted as a bridge between Hearst and daily life, maintaining a sense of routine amid uncertainty. Yet even her presence could not fully fill the void left by declining power and advancing age. Hearst Castle, once a symbol of mastery and control, now became the place where human fragility was most clearly exposed. On a broader level, American society began reassessing the symbols of pre-war extravagance. Hearst Castle, with its scale and history, was increasingly seen not as a marker of the present, but as a relic of a bygone era. This shift did not occur suddenly, but gradually, like the slow erosion of stone. Its quietness made its impact all the more profound. This fifth part of the story marks the moment when Hearst Castle ceased to be defined by ambition and instead entered into dialogue with time itself. It became less a challenge to history than a witness to it. In the silence of wartime and the twilight of its creator's life, the question of the mansion's ultimate meaning grew clearer. Could a dream of endless construction ever find closure in stillness? From that stillness, the journey of Hearst Castle moved into a new chapter, where legacy and memory would begin to replace personal ambition. After the war, the United States entered a new era, energized by reconstruction and optimism. For William Randolph Hearst, however, this forward momentum no longer aligned with his personal trajectory. Failing health, diminishing media influence, and mounting financial strain gave his final years a withdrawn, introspective character. Hearst Castle, once the center of a world he had orchestrated, now reflected most clearly the process of closure. Hearst's newspaper empire, which had once shaped national opinion, was forced into restructuring simply to survive. Mounting debts compelled his family and advisors to make painful decisions. Assets were sold. Collections, once considered inseparable from Saint-Simon, were removed from the estate. These separations were not merely material losses. They marked the end of an era in which Hearst believed that power and beauty could be accumulated without limit. During this period, Hearst was rarely present at Saint-Simon. The mansion, long inseparable from its owner's identity, began to exist more independently, almost as a separate entity with a life of its own. Rooms were closed, wings left unused, and spaces once animated by social life grew silent. Staff continued their duties, but no longer with the sense that they served a living center of authority. Hearst Castle entered a transitional state, suspended between a glorious past and an undefined future. Marion Davies, who had stood beside Hearst for decades, also faced a changed reality. Her role shifted from companion in public splendor to guardian of memory. She worked to preserve the spirit of Saint-Simon amid increasing limitations, yet she understood that the estate no longer belonged to Hearst's present. It had become part of a larger narrative, extending beyond their personal lives. When William Randolph Hearst died in 1951, his passing marked more than the end of a single life. It closed a chapter in American cultural history. Hearst Castle was no longer a project in progress, nor a residence of power. It became an unfinished legacy, bearing questions its creator never resolved. Uncompleted rooms and unrealized plans stood as evidence of an ambition that never found a final boundary. After Hearst's death, the future of Saint-Simon became an unavoidable question. The Hearst family faced both financial pressure and historical responsibility. Maintaining such a vast estate under private ownership was no longer sustainable. In this context, discussions emerged about transferring Hearst Castle into public stewardship. The idea that the mansion might become a shared cultural asset, an open space for reflection rather than possession, began to take form. This sixth part of the story marks the closing of a personal empire. Hearst Castle, built to assert permanence and authority, now stood on the threshold of transformation. It no longer belonged to individual ambition, but moved toward the realm of collective memory. That transition did not erase the contradictions embedded in its stone, but it opened the possibility that the mansion could be understood anew, not as an unfinished dream alone, but as a living lesson about power, time, and the limits of human control. After the death of William Randolph Hearst, Hearst Castle entered a new state of existence, no longer shaped by the daily presence of a powerful individual, but by decisions made at an institutional and collective level. The estate atop the hill at San Simon, once conceived as a private world, now faced the reality that it could not survive solely as a family memory. The stone walls that had carried personal meaning were gradually placed within the broader framework of public history. Confronted with financial pressure and the responsibility of preservation, the Hearst family made a pivotal decision. In 1958, the majority of the estate and its surrounding lands were donated to the state of California. This act did more than resolve immediate practical concerns. It fundamentally redefined the meaning of Hearst Castle. What had once been built to affirm individual power was transformed into a public legacy, opening its gates to millions and inviting society to engage directly with the past. The transition from private residence to public monument was neither simple nor seamless. Hearst Castle had never been designed for continuous public access. Corridors, staircases, and rooms originally intended for ceremony and control had to be adapted to meet standards of safety, conservation, and education. Historians, architects, and preservation specialists faced a delicate challenge: how to maintain the spirit of the estate while allowing it to live on in a new role. As a public site, Hearst Castle began to be interpreted through multiple lenses. For some, it stood as a testament to architectural ambition and artistic vision, particularly highlighting the long overlooked contribution of Julia Morgan, whose discipline and technical mastery shaped every stage of construction. For others, it symbolized excessive wealth and a period when power and resources were concentrated in the hands of a few. These perspectives did not cancel one another out. Instead, they coexisted, creating a layered and evolving narrative. The experience of visiting Hearst Castle also changed fundamentally. Guests no longer arrived as invitees to private gatherings, but as observers of history. They moved quietly through rooms once filled with voices and ritual, guided by interpretation rather than hierarchy. In that shift, the mansion became an educational space where history was not simply displayed, but felt through scale, light, and silence. This transformation raised new questions. Should Hearst Castle be preserved as a static monument, or as a living space that reflects evolving understandings of history? The decision to retain unfinished rooms and incomplete details revealed a conscious choice. Rather than masking the estate's lack of finality, curators allowed it to speak honestly about ambition and limitation. That incompleteness became central to its authenticity as a historical site. This seventh part of the story marks the rebirth of Hearst Castle within collective memory. No longer the possession of a single man, it became part of the cultural heritage of the nation. As a public legacy, San Simon ceased to declare power and instead invited reflection on wealth and responsibility, on ambition and restraint, and on the complex ways history chooses to endure. Once Hearst Castle had settled into its role as a public heritage site, its story did not come to an end. Instead, it shifted onto another level of meaning. The estate on the hill at San Simon was no longer viewed solely as a historical structure, but as an open text, one that each generation reads through the questions of its own time. In this sense, architecture ceased to function as an answer and instead became a question extended across decades. In the latter half of the 20th century, American attitudes toward wealth and power underwent profound change. Values once celebrated during Hearst's era, display, accumulation, and control over image, were increasingly questioned. Hearst Castle, by virtue of its scale and history, became a focal point for broader discussions about the nature of the American dream. Did success mean limitless possession and expansion, or did meaning emerge precisely from recognizing boundaries? Architectural historians began to view Hearst Castle as an anomaly. While many buildings of its era embraced modernism, minimalism, and functional efficiency, San Simon turned deliberately toward the past. Its forms drew heavily from classical European traditions, particularly Spanish ecclesiastical architecture and Mediterranean fortresses. This was not a nostalgic accident, but a cultural stance. It reflected skepticism toward rapid modernization and a desire to anchor identity in historical continuity. Hearst Castle thus embodied the tension between progress and preservation. Over time, the role of Julia Morgan in shaping this narrative became increasingly clear. Long overshadowed by the figure of Hearst himself, Morgan was gradually recognized as a master architect in her own right. Later scholarship emphasized that it was her discipline, adaptability, and ethical rigor that allowed the project to function at all. Hearst Castle, in this light, also became a testament to the unseen labor behind monumental ambition. For the public, the experience of Hearst Castle proved deeply ambivalent. On one level, visitors were overwhelmed by its scale and extravagance. On another, many left with a sense of emotional distance, even unease. The mansion, despite its grandeur, did not easily offer warmth or intimacy. This reaction was not a failure of design, but part of its meaning. Hearst Castle was never built to comfort. It was built to assert, to control, and ultimately, to provoke reflection. As environmental awareness grew and questions of sustainability entered public discourse, San Simon was placed within yet another evaluative framework. Maintaining a vast estate on a coastal hilltop raised concerns about resources, preservation, and responsibility. These discussions extended the relevance of Hearst Castle beyond history, linking it to contemporary debates about stewardship and legacy. Once again, architecture served as a bridge between past choices and future consequences. This eighth part of the story reveals how Hearst Castle continues to evolve in meaning, even as its physical form remains unchanged. The estate does not dictate conclusions. Instead, it invites ongoing dialogue between individual ambition and collective responsibility. In that openness, Hearst Castle endures not as a frozen monument, but as a living question that continues to resonate within the modern age. As Hearst Castle entered the 21st century, it no longer existed solely as a carefully preserved historical site, but as a space where collective memory was constantly being reshaped. Each generation that ascended the hill at San Simon arrived with different questions, different expectations, and it was this continual reinterpretation that kept the estate from ever becoming truly silent. The stone walls remained unchanged, but the way people understood them did not. In the age of digital media and instant imagery, Hearst Castle was reframed through countless new lenses. Film, television, photography, books, and social media transformed San Simon into a widely recognized icon, sometimes detached from the complex historical context that gave it meaning. Images of lavish pools and grand halls circulated easily, admired for their beauty, while the deeper story of power, isolation, and unfinished ambition demanded a patience that modern culture rarely encourages. In this contrast, Hearst Castle became a clear example of how heritage can be reduced to surface imagery if history is not actively preserved in narrative form. Historians and site managers faced a subtle but serious challenge. They were not only responsible for conserving the physical structure, but for safeguarding its meaning. Telling the story of Hearst Castle could not stop at luxury or celebrity anecdotes. It required placing William Randolph Hearst fully within the context of his time acknowledging both his influence and his controversies, his achievements and his contradictions. Only through that balance could the estate function as a living legacy rather than a decorative backdrop. Memory at Hearst Castle is also inseparable from the history of journalism and media power. In an era defined by rapid information flow, the story of Hearst, a man who once shaped national opinion through printed headlines, gains renewed relevance. Saint-Simon thus speaks not only about architecture, but about responsibility in storytelling itself. The mansion stands as a reminder of both the reach and the limits of controlling public narrative. For many visitors, the experience of Hearst Castle is deeply personal. Some see in it the American dream pushed to its extreme. Others sense a quiet melancholy, born from grandeur without intimacy. These responses do not contradict one another. Together, they demonstrate that this legacy does not enforce a single interpretation. It allows personal memory to intersect with historical memory, creating a space where meaning remains fluid. This ninth part of the story focuses on how Hearst Castle lives within modern remembrance. It is no longer simply the story of one man or one family, but a reflection of how society chooses to remember its past. What is emphasized and what is left unsaid both carry significance. In its dignified stillness, Saint-Simon reminds us that legacy does not reside solely in stone and mortar, but in the ongoing act of remembering, questioning, and retelling. When looking back at the entire story of Hearst Castle, what ultimately lingers is not only its immense scale or its overwhelming beauty, but the unresolved feeling of a question left unanswered. On the hilltop at Saint-Simon, suspended between ocean and sky, the estate exists like an ellipsis in history, inviting pause, reflection, and inquiry into the limits of ambition, power, and the very definition of success. Hearst Castle has no clear moment of completion. There was no ceremonial opening to mark the end of its construction. No final blueprint was ever closed and archived. Unfinished rooms and incomplete details are not flaws, but essential characteristics of the estate itself. They reflect a mind that resisted closure, a man who believed that the next addition, the next expansion, would finally bring the sense of fulfillment that the present never quite delivered. Yet it was precisely this endless continuation that transformed the mansion into an open question, one that extended far beyond the life of its creator. Within the broader context of American history, Hearst Castle embodies a profound paradox. It was built within a culture that celebrated opportunity, progress, and the future, yet it turned resolutely toward the past, seeking permanence in the forms of classical architecture. This contradiction was not accidental. It expressed a deeper cultural anxiety, a fear that rapid change might erode identity and meaning. Saint-Simon thus preserved not only personal ambition, but the unease of an entire era. When today's visitors walk through Hearst Castle, they do not merely enter a historic site. They step into a dialogue with history itself. Questions of accumulation, media power, social responsibility, and legacy emerge quietly through space and silence. The mansion does not instruct or judge. It simply exists, compelling each observer to arrive at their own conclusions. This 10th part of the story does not close with a definitive conclusion. Instead, it allows Hearst Castle to remain exactly as it was built, unfinished. The house born of an ambition that could never be fully satisfied now stands as a question addressed to every generation. When human beings build in search of meaning, is the act of building itself enough, or do the inner voids persist, demanding something beyond space, beauty, and grandeur? On the hilltop at Saint-Simon, amid stone and wind, that question still echoes. As the story of Hearst Castle reaches its conclusion, what remains is not a simple judgment of right or wrong, success or failure. On the hilltop at Saint-Simon, the estate still stands, unmoved by wind and time, a silent witness to a turbulent century. It is no longer the private dream of William Randolph Hearst, nor a structure built solely to serve personal ambition. It has become part of a shared memory, preserved not to glorify or condemn, but to invite reflection. Hearst Castle reveals how deeply one individual can imprint himself onto physical space, while also exposing the limits of that imprint. Hearst possessed wealth, power, and cultural influence beyond the reach of most of his contemporaries. He could acquire fragments of Europe's past, transport them across oceans, and rearrange them according to his own vision. Yet even with all of this, he could not purchase a sense of completion. The mansion, standing at the intersection of splendor and incompletion, remains the clearest expression of that paradox. As a public legacy, Hearst Castle no longer answers to the ambitions of a single man. Instead, it opens a space for society to confront itself. It asks how we understand wealth, what responsibilities accompany power, and what we choose to preserve for those who come after us. These questions are not confined to history. They resonate in the present, in a world where accumulation and image continue to shape how value is measured. The presence of Julia Morgan, Marion Davies, and countless others in this story reminds us that no legacy is ever the work of one person alone. Hearst Castle exists because of the labor, discipline, and quiet dedication of many individuals whose contributions were long overshadowed by power. To recognize the estate as a shared inheritance is also to acknowledge those unseen lives and efforts. Ultimately, Hearst Castle does not demand admiration, nor does it insist on condemnation. It asks only for attention, and for honesty with history, with unresolved contradictions, and with the truth that human beings are driven to leave marks upon the world before time erases them. On the hill at San Simon, that mark does not take the form of an answer, but of a question that endures. The conclusion of this story does not close the gates of Hearst Castle. It opens a perspective. As visitors depart, what matters most is not what they have seen, but what they carry with them: thoughts about ambition, limitation, and the meaning of building itself. For sometimes, the greatest value of a monument lies not in its perfection, but in its power to make us pause and ask what, in the end, we are truly building for the future.